Hi, crime enthusiasts. This is your host Ashita, and the story I'm gonna tell you today is about Dorothy Scott, a 32-year-old woman and single mother. Dorothy Jane Scott disappeared from the UC Irvine Medical Center in the early morning hours of May 28, 1980. Witnesses reported seeing her speeding away past them, and they waved to try to get her attention. However, the car didn't slow down. 4 hours later, Dorothy's car was found in an alley, engulfed in flames, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Dorothy was 32 years old when she disappeared. She was a dedicated single mother to her 4-year-old son, Shanty, whom she affectionately called Sean. At the time, Dorothy lived with her aunt in Stanton, California, a short 20-minute drive away from her parents' home in Anaheim. She worked as a bookkeeper at a jointly owned business, balancing her responsibilities as a mother and an employee. Dorothy was a reserved individual who preferred spending her time at home with her son and parents. She wasn't particularly social and was known for her quiet, introspective nature. Dorothy was also a believer in God, and her faith played a significant role in her life. She focused on her family and daily responsibilities, creating a simple yet fulfilling life around those closest to her. She worked at Swinger's Side Shop and Custom John's Head Shop. It's a quirky little store that sold counterculture items popular in the 70s and the early 80s. It wasn't your average shop. Think incense, retro posters, and even old school marijuana paraphernalia like pipes and rolling papers. Dorothy Scott was last seen on May 28, 1980, at the University of California, Irvine Medical Center. While attending an employee meeting, she noticed something unusual about her co-worker, Conrad Boston. His arms were swollen and he had a raised, inflamed bug bite that looked concerning. Dorothy was always caring and attentive and insisted that Conrad see a doctor to make sure the bite wasn't infected or poisonous. Concerned for his well being, she made plans to take him to the hospital. Another co worker, 18-year-old Pam, had offered to accompany them, and then the three of them headed out to the UC Irvine Medical Center that night. Upon arriving at the hospital, he was informed that the bite was from a poisonous black widow spider, and he was immediately taken for treatment. However, on the way to the hospital, Dorothy made a quick stop at her parents' house to drop off her son, who had come with her to work that day. Original reports stated that she went to check on her son, and there has been a lot of speculation about why she would do that, especially considering she was taking someone to the hospital. But in a more recent interview with Pam, the female co worker who accompanied Dorothy mentioned this story. Pam also noted that Dorothy changed her black scarf to a red one, which seemed strange given the situation. This is a very crucial point to remember later in the case. The hours stretched long at the hospital. Conrad, pale and sweating from a black widow spider bite, endured a grueling treatment while Pam and Dorothy lingered in the waiting room. They passed the time in fragments, flipping through outdated magazines, staring blankly at the TV, and glancing at the clock. Finally, close to 11 p.m., Conrad was discharged. Pam stayed by his side as they headed to the pharmacy to pick up his prescription. Dorothy volunteered to grab the car, sparing Conrad the walk across the dimly lit parking lot. But minutes turned into more minutes. Dorothy didn't return. They waited a few minutes, but when Dorothy didn't appear, they decided to head to the parking lot themselves. As they stepped outside, a car resembling Dorothy's came into view, speeding past them. Waving frantically, they tried to catch the driver's attention, convinced it was her. But the car didn't stop. Instead, it blew through the stop sign at the exit and vanished into the night, swallowed by the darkness of the road ahead. Conrad and Pam exchanged worried glances, immediately assuming Dorothy must have had an urgent emergency involving her son. With no cell phones to call and check, they lingered there in growing unease, waiting nearly an hour for her to return. Then they eventually called her parents to check if she went home. A few months before the tragic event of May 1980, something unsettling began to happen in Dorothy Scott's life. In October of 1979, she started receiving strange phone calls both at work and at home. The calls were mysterious, with a voice on the other end that was increasingly menacing. Dorothy was never able to identify the caller, but the frequency and the intensity of the calls grew over time. The person on the line seemed to know intimate details of her life, like where she was, what she was doing, and even what she was wearing. Dorothy Scott was at home one evening when she received an unexpected call from this stranger. The man on the other end professed his love for her. At first, the calls were strange but harmless, mixing declarations of love with old comets. However, the calls soon took a darker turn. The man's tone shifted, and sometimes the calls became threatening. He could swing from obsession to menace, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. One day, the calls escalated to something deeply unnerving. The stranger told Dorothy that he had left a rose on her car. When she went out to check, sure enough, there it was, a withered flower, a chilling reminder that someone was watching her every move. The call soon became more explicit and threatening. The man told her that he would chop her into pieces if he got close to her. Terrified, Dorothy told her mother that she was extremely concerned for their safety. She even started to consider buying a gun to protect herself and her son Sean. Dorothy, feeling increasingly unsafe, took extra precautions, signing up for karate classes to defend herself. But what truly unsettled her was the feeling that she had heard the voice of the caller before. It was a haunting thought that never left her. Dorothy was convinced that the person on the other side wasn't a stranger. They were someone she knew, someone who had been in her life before. But who? The mystery only deepened as the phone calls continued. A question that comes often to my mind is why Dorothy never called the police about the disturbing phone calls. I came across a Reddit article suggesting that she did file a complaint at some point, but the investigation was brief and ultimately closed without any significant leads. While I'm entirely not sure if this actually happened, it's not uncommon for stalking cases like this not to be taken seriously by authorities, especially back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Many victims of stalking often feel that their complaints won't be prioritized or that law enforcement won't be able to do much without concrete evidence. It's possible that Dorothy didn't push the matter further either because she felt the situation wasn't being handled properly or because the police were unable to take any action at that time. Around 4:30 a.m., about 4 hours after Dorothy Scott vanished from the medical center, a resident called police to report smoke rising from an alleyway. When officers arrived, they found something straight out of a nightmare. Dorothy's car, completely engulfed in flames. But here's the chilling part. Her car wasn't just burning, it was abandoned in a rush. The headlights were still on, the driver's side door was wide open, and it looked like whoever left it there couldn't get away fast enough. In the trunk, police found a gas canister and they discovered an accelerant had been poured on the passenger side to ignite the fire. The outside of the car was mostly untouched, but the inside completely destroyed, clear charred down to nothing. Sergeant Bob Taft, the cold case investigator now working on Dorothy's case, said that the scene made one thing clear. This wasn't random. Someone had set that fire on purpose, fast and deliberate. But the most unsettling deal? Dorothy herself was nowhere to be found. About a week after Dorothy Scott's disappearance, her parents began receiving chill phone calls from an unidentified man. In the first call, the man asked Dorothy's mother, Vida, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" When Vida replied yes, the man coldly stated, "I have her," before hanging up. From that point on, the calls became a horrifying pattern. Nearly every Wednesday afternoon, the same man would call, claiming either that he had Dorothy or that he had killed her. The calls were always brief and always timed to occur when Vida was home alone. The torment continued for years until April 1984, when the stalker made a critical mistake. He called during the evening when Dorothy's father, Jacob, happened to answer the phone. After that, the calls abruptly stopped, leaving only silence in their wake, and no answers about what truly happened to Dorothy Scott. Could the killer have feared that Dorothy's father would recognize his voice? As Dorothy mentioned, she recognized the caller's voice, which raises an interesting question. Could her father have known him too? To give you some context, let me share a bit about Dorothy's father, Jacob Scott, and the shop he ran. Dorothy's father, Jacob, was the original owner of the Swingers Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop, where Dorothy and her co workers worked. But now both businesses were jointly owned by John Cochlear. Although Jacob had stepped back from managing the day to day operations, he still pitched in with odd jobs whenever they needed him. Here's where it gets eerie. I have a strong feeling that this person responsible was somehow connected to the shop. Maybe an old employee, a mechanic, or even a handyman. Someone who had been around and knew the ins and outs of the business. It would be hard for anyone else to track Dorothy's movements so precisely unless they had some inside knowledge of her routine, where she was and what she was doing at any given time. The level of familiarity and obsession suggests a connection to the shop or the people who frequented it. Police didn't have much lead on this. After Dorothy's apparent abduction from the hospital parking lot, her father Jacob worked closely with the Irvine police in the search for answers about her disappearance and the burning of her car. Early on, Jacob and the investigators made a strategic decision to keep many details of the case under wraps. Their goal was to avoid giving any information that might fuel the imaginations of the wrong kind of people, those who might try to taunt the family or mislead the investigation. It was a delicate balance. They needed to find Dorothy, but they also wanted to protect her loved ones from unnecessary torment and preserve the integrity of the case. Dorothy's ex partner, Dennis Terry, the father of her son, Sean, was living in Fairgrove, Missouri at the time of her disappearance. Naturally, police investigated him as part of their efforts, but his alibi checked out. He was completely ruled out as a suspect. Dorothy had been quiet about her past relationship with Terry. While she had spent some time touring with an all girls band, it seems she was in this relationship during a period when she was living in Anaheim. After moving back home, she rarely talked about that chapter of her life. Interestingly, just a few days before Dorothy vanished, Terry had been in town visiting. During that time, the two got into a heated argument over the custody of Sean. He would now take full custody for the next 4 years. Dorothy was adamantly against the idea and refused, leading to a major confrontation. Despite the tension between them, investigators confirmed Terry was not involved in what happened to Dorothy. About 2 weeks after Dorothy's disappearance, her father Jacob Scott reached his breaking point. Frustrated by the lack of progress in the investigation and desperate for answers, he contacted the Santa Ana Register, a local newspaper, to share his daughter's story. On Thursday, June 11, 1980, the Register published an article detailing Dorothy's mysterious disappearance and the discovery of her burnt out vehicle. They also announced a reward of 2,500 for anyone with information that could help solve the case. That same day, something chilling happened. Pat Riley, the managing editor of the Santa Ana Register, received an anonymous call while working in the newsroom. A man, his voice calm yet haunting, claimed responsibility for Dorothy's disappearance and murder. I killed Dorothy Scott, the caller began. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her. But this wasn't just another prank call. Riley immediately sensed that the man on the other end wasn't a hoaxer. What made the call even more disturbing was the level of detail the man provided, details that haven't been made public. He accurately described that Dorothy has been at the hospital at the night of her disappearance because a co worker, Conrad, had been bitten by a spider. He also mentioned that Dorothy had been wearing a red scarf that evening. These specifics convinced Riley that he was speaking to someone who had intimate knowledge of what had happened to Dorothy, possibly the person responsible. The caller even claimed that Dorothy had phoned him from the hospital that night to tell him where she was. This assertion, however, conflicted with other accounts. Dorothy's co worker and friend, Pam Head, had told investigators that Dorothy never left her side while they were at the hospital, except when she went to the restroom or briefly stepped out to bring her car around to pick them up. Pam was adamant that Dorothy hadn't made any phone calls during the time at the medical center. This left investigators with questions. Could Dorothy have called someone during her brief stop at her parents' house on the way to the hospital? Or had she used the phone at work before they left that evening? No one remembered hearing or seeing her make such a call, but the caller's claim introduced an unsettling possibility that Dorothy might have been in contact with someone who knew her movements that night. There are many theories surrounding Dorothy Scott's disappearance, and one question that often comes to my mind is why Pam and Conrad waited so long at the hospital before calling for help. While it's true that there were no mobile phones at that time, it's still puzzling why they didn't make a call sooner. The hospital had phones available, and there were plenty of options for getting a ride back home. It's possible that Pam and Conrad simply didn't consider calling someone for a ride right away, or perhaps they were waiting for Dorothy to return from getting the car. But the delay in reaching out still raised some questions. Why didn't they think to call someone sooner? Had they assumed Dorothy would be back quite quickly? Or was there something else at play that caused the delay? Could they have been distracted or unsure of what to do next? These are the questions that, given the circumstances, might seem more pressing in the hindsight, especially now that the case remains unsolved and so many details still don't add up. The case of Dorothy Scott exposes the deeply unsettling and destructive nature of obsession. Compulsive love, one of the most disturbing manifestations of obsessive behavior that blurs the line between reality and fantasy. In such cases, an individual becomes so fixated on someone that they develop an unhealthy attachment, convincing themselves that they are in a relationship, even when the object of their obsession has no knowledge of their feelings, or in Dorothy's case, no interest in reciprocating them. This kind of fixation often stems from a rapt perception of love that fails to acknowledge the fundamental concept of respect, autonomy, and mutual consent in relationships. Instead, it distorts the notion of love into something possessive, suffocating, and potentially lethal. Obsessive love, at its core, involves the stalker constructing a narrative in their mind where they believe they are in a deep, intimate connection with the person they are fixated on. This narrative often has no basis in reality, but for the stalker, the lack of genuine reciprocation is easily dismissed or rationalized. They may see every interaction, no matter how small, as evidence of affection, and every moment of attention, however fleeting, as confirmation that the victim feels the same way. Dorothy Scott, in her kindness and thoughtfulness, may have intended to encourage or enable these delusions, but for someone who is prone to obsessive thoughts, even a simple conversation, a polite exchange, or a few moments of sheer space can be misconstrued as a romantic interest. The twisted version of love is fueled by an overwhelming sense of entitlement, where the stalker feels as if they deserve the affection and attention of their victim, regardless of what the victim may want or feel. For Dorothy Stalker, this meant that every moment spent here in her presence transformed into an imagined connection that existed solely in his mind. He may have convinced himself that because Dorothy had spoken with him on the phone, they had some unspoken bond. This idea of connection, however tenuous and delusional, gave a sense of ownership over her, leading him to believe that he had the right to pursue her relentlessly, even at the cost of her safety, peace, and ultimately her life. One of the most chilling aspects of this obsession is how the stalker's sense of reality becomes increasingly distorted. As the stalking escalates, the stalker becomes more and more convinced that their delusion is reality. They began to believe that they have a right to the person they are fixated on and that any action they take to secure their love is justified. In this delusion, the stalker sees no boundaries, no respect for the other person's feelings or desires, only their own obsessive need to claim what they believe is rightly theirs. The possessiveness is what makes stalking so dangerous. When a person becomes so convinced that they have the right to possess someone, they are willing to do anything to secure that possession, even if that means resorting to violence or manipulation. What makes this even more tragic is the fact that Dorothy, by all accounts, was a kind, compassionate woman who likely never intended to lead anyone or cause any harm. She was a mother, a daughter, and a friend, someone who likely went on about her life without ever suspecting that someone was watching her every move, interpreting her every word through the lens of an unhealthy obsession. To her, the kindness she offered to others was simply part of her being a good person, but to her stalker, it was something far more sinister, an invitation for him to insert himself into her life in the way she never intended. This again is a stark reminder of how dangerous obsession can be. What begins as a seemingly harmless attention or affection can quickly turn into a dangerous fixation, and from there it can spiral into something even darker. The line between reality and fantasy can become dangerously blurry for the person obsessed, and they may act out their delusions with tragic consequences. This is a key reason why stalking must be taken seriously, because what starts as a persistent calls or unwanted attention can escalate quickly, and the result can be catastrophic. The phone call to the Santa Ana registered only deepened the mystery surrounding Dorothy's disappearance. It not only implied that her abduction had been carefully planned, but also pointed to a disturbingly personal motive behind the crime. For Jacob Scott and his family, the call was both chilling and maddening, a cruel reminder that the person responsible for tearing their world apart was still out there, hidden in the shadows, watching and waiting. 4 years after Dorothy's disappearance, everything changed on August 6, 1984. A foreman working for a construction company prepared to dig a trench for Pacific Bell telephone lines near Santa Ana Canyon Road stumbled upon the charred remains of a dog. Upon further investigation, The foreman's casual joke with his backhoe operator about watching out for dead bodies turned chillingly true when human remains were also uncovered. The remains were partial, and the complete skeleton was unfound, but among the debris, a human skull was discovered. Dental records later confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. Nearby, a turquoise ring and a small wristwatch were found, which Dorothy's mother, Vera, immediately recognized as her daughter's. The discovery brought a sense of closure, but it also raised more questions. Investigators weren't sure about the connection between the dog and Dorothy. Some theorize that given the dog might have belonged to the killer and, in an odd and macabre gesture, was buried with Dorothy when it died. Given the circumstances, this theory holds some weight as it seems unlikely the dog was simply placed next to Dorothy by chance. Anthony Sherlock, a key investigator on the case, doesn't believe that the spot where Dorothy's remains were found was where initially she was left. The location, near a hilly area, suggests that she could have been left higher up, with rain and erosion shifting her remains over time. This could explain why the dog's body was found in close proximity to hers, as both might have been moved from their original resting places by the forces of nature. Adding a further layer of mysteries, Dorothy's remains had been partially charred due to a brush fire that had ravaged the area back in 1982. The length of time the body had been exposed to the elements made it impossible to definitely determine the cause of death. However, a particularly eerie detail that stood out, Dorothy's wristwatch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on March 29, 1980, the same night she was last seen alive. That time, just 1 hour after she was seen leaving the hospital, could not have been a coincidence. Many, including Vera, believe that the killer had intentionally stopped the watch at the moment of Dorothy's death, a chilling touch that added a personal and unsettling layer to the crime. Unfortunately, Dorothy's parents would never get the closure they desperately sought. Despite the horrifying discovery of their daughter's remains, the questions surrounding her disappearance and death remained unanswered. Jacob Scott, heartbroken by the loss and the years of unanswered questions, passed away on May 24, 1994, without knowing the full truth about what happened to his daughter. Vida, too, carried the pain of that unresolved mystery, and 8 years later, in 2002, she passed away, still haunted by the absence of answers. Both parents were left to carry the burden of their grief, never knowing who took their daughter or why. But in a recent interview with Sean Scott, Dorothy's son, in 2017, he mentioned he believes Mike Butler kidnapped and killed his mother. Mike had a unique and diverse life journey, shaped by his military background and his later ventures in the music and academic worlds. Growing up as an army brat, he was no stranger to discipline and change, moving with his family from one army post to another. His father's military career was a constant presence, and when the family eventually settled in Southern California, Mike's own path began to take shape. An unaccomplished athlete, he excelled in cross country and track, earning MVP honors. He went on to attend California State University, Fullerton, where he studied English, but his life would soon take a turn towards the military. At 20, Mike was drafted into the United States Army, where his strong attention to detail and leadership skills quickly set him apart. He was trained as a drill instructor for new recruits, a role that not many people are chosen for. After serving briefly in that capacity, he was assigned to Hohenfels, Germany, where his job as news writer for Stars and Stripes News allowed him to combine his writing skills with his service. He also served as the base commander's public information and media officer, capturing life on base through photography. His military service was as varied as it was notable, shaping his character in ways that would serve him in the civilian world. When Mike's military career came to an end, he stepped into a very different lifestyle, moving into the world of music as a roadie for rock bands, including the legendary Beach Boys and his sister's all girl band, Bertha. The music industry was an exciting shift, but it wasn't long before he settled in Orange County, California, and found a steady job as a machine shop maintenance employee and later as an electrician at Biola College. His life's trajectory was a fascinating blend of discipline, creativity, and adaptability, with each chapter of his life adding new layers to his identity. The theory surrounding Butler, a reportedly unstable individual living in the Santiago murders and involved in cult activity, adds an eerie twist to Dorothy's case. His connection to the discovery of the dog near the remains starts to make more sense in this context. The obsession mirrors the behavior of the mysterious scholar who tormented Dorothy's family, and it raises the chilling possibility that Butler, like the caller, had become fixated on Dorothy in a dangerous and unhealthy way. What makes this even more troubling is the revelation that Butler's sister worked with Dorothy at Swinger's Side Shop, the same store where Dorothy had spent much of her time. This connection deepens the potential link between Dorothy and Butler as it suggests that he could have been familiar with her in a more personal way, possibly leading to an unhealthy obsession. The cult activity Butler was reportedly involved in only adds to the complexity and danger of the situation. It's not hard to imagine how his fixation on Dorothy could have spiraled into something violent, much like the twisted thoughts of the anonymous scholar who claimed to be Dorothy's captor. Mike's proximity to Dorothy, walking across the street and seeing her regularly, could certainly explain how the stalker knew so much about her daily routine, including what she wore when she was likely to be coming and going. His familiarity with her schedule would have provided the perfect opportunity for someone with obsessive tendencies to monitor her and develop an unhealthy fixation. If Butler was indeed the stalker, as some suspect, it could explain how he knew intimate details about Dorothy's life, which would have made his actions all the more chilling. The discovery of the dog near Dorothy's remains takes on a more sinister tone when considering Butler's possible involvement in rituals, especially if there was any connection between his unstable mindset, his obsession with Dorothy, and the dog's presence. Could the dog have been a part of ritualistic act? It's a disturbing thought, but one that aligns with the kind of behavior often linked to individuals with cult like or obsessive tendencies. Despite these theories, it seems the police never pursued Butler as a solid lead in the case. He was never formally investigated further, and while Sergeant Taft expressed interest in questioning him again, Butler's death in 2014 means that any further questioning will never happen. The fact that this potential lead was left unexplored adds yet another layer of frustration and mystery to a case that has never been truly solved. Dorothy's family, as well as those following the case, are left to wonder if Butler's possible involvement could have been a crucial piece of the puzzle that was never fully investigated. The case still remains unsolved, with no new leads emerging despite continued investigation. For Dorothy's family, the pain of her disappearance and the years of uncertainty is still a deep wound. Her son, Sean, now grown, shared his heartache in an interview with Paula Zane, expressing the profound impact of growing up without a mother. To grow up without a mom, it's not fair, Sean said, a sentiment that speaks to the lasting void left by Dorothy's absence in his life. Dorothy's brother, Jim, too carries the weight of her disappearance every day. He still keeps a picture of her on his desk, a daily reminder of the sister he lost. In his words and the look in his eyes, it's clear that the loss of Dorothy continues to haunt him. Every day he thinks about her, a testament to the enduring grief that comes with a loved one's unexplained disappearance. The emotional toll on her family is palpable, and despite the passage of time, the hope for answers remain just as strong as ever. Thank you so much for joining me today, and don't forget to subscribe to my podcast on Spotify and YouTube so you never miss an update. I appreciate you joining me. Have an amazing week ahead. Until next time, stay safe, crime enthusiasts.